part of any kind of Greek city in the ancient world. And what Alexander and his successors did was they took that basic Greek structure and they transplanted it all over the Eastern Mediterranean, whether they were in Egypt or Syria or Asia Minor or any place else, which is why you can travel right now to Turkey or Syria or Israel or Jordan or Egypt, and you can see excavations of towns, and it's remarkable how they all look so much alike, because they're all inspired by this originally Greek model of the city. So that's one of the most important things about Alexander and his successors is they Hellenized the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and that meant every major city would have a certain commonality to it. It would have a certain koine to it. That is a Greek overlay over what maybe also be there, the original indigenous kind of cultures and languages. The other thing you have is religious syncretism. The Greek word synkresis means a mixing together. When Alexander gets to Persia, let's say when he gets to Egypt, he knows that there is this god Isis, this female god Isis, that's very important. You see statues of her all over the place. Well, Alexander just followed a custom that had been taught by philosophy and other kinds of things that, oh, well, they worship Isis. But, Isis is sort of like Artemis. So sometimes you'd see they'd make statues of Isis look like statues of Artemis back home. But Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. So these Greeks would say, well, we have another goddess of the hunt, and you'd find other goddesses of the hunt. Or when they'd get to Jerusalem, they see, oh, these people worship Yahweh. Well, that's just Zeus. That's just another name for Zeus. It's the same God. They just have a different name for it. Alexander took this tendency of syncretism, of mixing together different religious traditions from different places, and he used it as a self-conscious propaganda technique. He would identify the goddess Isis with some Greek goddess. And so all the time, these different gods from different places were basically all said to be simply different cultural representations, different names for what were generally the same gods all over the place. Also, though, what they would do is sometimes they wouldn't try to simply say these gods are the same. What they would just is add on more gods. They'd just say, oh, well, we got to Egypt and we found out there are a whole lot more gods than we knew about. Or we get to Syria and look at all these gods that the Syrians worship. Well, we'll just add those into our pantheon of gods too. And this is part of what ancient religion was like, is that people were not exclusive. You didn't have to worry. Just because you worshiped one god doesn't mean you couldn't worship another god or several gods or 5 gods or 100 gods. The Romans, when they came on the scene in the East, and they gradually became more and more powerful, they destroyed Corinth in a big battle in 144 BCE. Pompey was the Roman general who took over Jerusalem in 63 BCE. So the Romans were in charge of Judea from 63 BCE on. And this is very important because the Romans, as their power grew in the East, they simply moved increasingly into the Eastern Mediterranean, and they adopted the whole Greek system, the Greek world, and they didn't even try to make it non-Greek. So Romans didn't go around trying to get people in the East to speak Latin. They might put up as an official inscription in an Eastern city in Latin, but they'd almost always, if it was an official inscription, it would also be listed in Greek. So Romans who ruled in the East were expected to speak Greek, and by this time, all educated Roman men were expected to be able to speak Greek well, if possible. So the Romans didn't try to make the East Roman in that sense, culturally, nor did they try to change the language. Greek language, culture, and religions, different religions, and the syncretism, Greek education, the polis structure, all of these things remained in the East throughout the Roman rule of the East. But there's one thing that the Romans made even more of than the Greeks had made of, and this is the patron-client structure. This is a bit more of a distinctly Roman institution, even a legal institution, but it's important for understanding both the Roman Empire as well as early Christianity and its patron-client relations. The household structure of a Roman household was this. And I say household because our word family, which we usually take to mean the biological family, the father, the mother, the children, maybe the grandchildren, maybe the extended family, but we usually mean by it the immediate, the nuclear family with some extension. That use of the English word family, although it comes from the Latin familia, means something totally different in Latin. The Latin word familia didn't mean that biological kin group. It actually was originally used for the slaves of a household. The slaves and the freed persons of a Roman household were legally the ones who were the familia. But so when I say family, we try to avoid even talking about the Roman family because it means something so different to them than what it means to us. So I'll tend to talk about the Roman household because that's what's more meaningful sociologically when we talk about this. The Roman household was constructed like a pyramid. Imagine this is a pyramid, not a triangle. At the top of it is the head of the household, the man. The paterfamilias. Now, increasingly, you'll actually see this written in the New York Times or used in politics, but it comes from the Latin, and it referred to the head of the household. Pater, father, familias is the household, the family. The paterfamilias is the oldest man of the household. Under him is his sons, his daughters, and then at the bottom are his slaves, and here are his freedmen, freed persons. And then also you consider in some ways free people who may exist as clients. But legally, the word client in Latin refers to the freed slaves of a paterfamilias. Now, where's the wife in this picture? Notice I didn't put the wife and the mother in there. Why is that? Because legally, she's actually not part of this man's household. She remains part of the household of her father. And she's legally under the control of her father probably, or her brothers if her father is dead, or her grandfather if her grandfather is still alive. But since life expectancy in the ancient world was much less than ours, you didn't have usually several generations in these households because older people just died. The wife, though, is legally a part of her own household over here. Why did the Romans do that? That's very different from the Greeks, very different from other people in the ancient Mediterranean. Why did they want to make sure that the daughters stayed in the households of their fathers? They did this because they didn't want the upper class in Rome, who were the elite, they didn't want any one household or any small group of households to become too powerful. And if you have women marrying off into other families and then they leave the household of their fathers and they are officially and legally a household of somebody else, that may end up increasing those households that have intermarriage coming in and not so much intermarriage going out. By keeping women under the household of the men of their original family, the upper class Romans tried to balance these different households in size and importance. They didn't care about the lower class, really. The lower class didn't really count much. Now, slaves obviously are under the paterfamilias. When a slave is freed, and in the ancient world, in Roman Empire, most slaves were eventually freed unless they just died before long. They became a freed man. They didn't become a free man. They became a freed man. And that was legally different. So the status of slave was lowest, freed persons was next and highest in Roman law, and free people were next. But even though they became freed, they were still considered a member of this guy's household as his client and his freedman, and they owed certain duties to him. For example, they might paterfamilia would often put a slave up in business, give a slave enough money to run a business, and that the slave could keep a lot of the income from that business for himself, and the slave could actually gather together a bit of money for himself. He couldn't legally own the money. His master legally owned everything the slave owned. But practically, and in some legal context, what they would do is they'd allow the slave the use of that money, and that's called the peculium. Now, when the slave is freed by the owner, the slave could take the peculium with him, and then he could set up his own business, but he'd still be a client of the owner because he's still officially part of his household. So this maintained even when, and why would a person free a slave? Well, if you have a slave, that slave can't actually sign contracts. The slave might be your business manager, but all the slave could do is the paperwork. But if you need a slave representing your business and you live in Rome and you need somebody in Ostia, the port city of Rome, to be able to be there and watch your imports and your exports of your business, you need someone who can sign contracts, who can lend money, who can borrow money, who can do things like that. Slaves can't do that legally, but freed men can. So rich Romans were often freeing slaves for their own purposes. It was not like they were giving them a great deal. This was part of their constructing their own business expansion. Sons and daughters, though, were still part of the household as long as the paterfamilias was alive. So sons legally were still under their paterfamilias. Now, why is this important for the rest of the stuff? This will be very important because Christians started out as house churches, and their house churches fit sometimes the model of a Greek ecclesia, an assembly, but sometimes the model of the Roman household. And so this household structure becomes very important for the growth and structure and even the theology of Christianity eventually.